The scent of stale coffee, burnt oil, and the faint metallic temps of old ambulance exhaust was the only perfume Brandon Carter had known for 4 years. He was 42, though the harsh light filtering into the cavernous bay of the derelict New York City Fire Department substation made him look closer to 50. His refuge was a forgotten, dust-caked corner in the back of the station's enormous garage, where retired engine parts and stacks of frayed ropes gathered like spectral guardians. His tailored three-piece suit, once a symbol of his reign as CEO of Nexus Global Investments, was now a crumpled, threadbare mockery draped over a discarded wooden pallet he used as a makeshift bed. He had lost everything: his company, his Manhattan penthouse, his reputation, and, most devastatingly, his beloved wife, who had succumbed to a sudden, inexplicable illness barely 6 months after the financial collapse. The press had branded him the architect of a $350 million catastrophe. A vulture who had devoured the life savings of thousands. Every morning, he woke up feeling the cold weight of that infamy pressing down on his chest. A lead apron of guilt that chemotherapy could not cure and time could not soften. He watched the activity of the station from the shadows, the ceaseless energy of the firefighters and EMTs, a stark contrast to his own terminal inertia. He felt like a ghost haunting the vibrant living. The only person who acknowledged his existence without judgment was Marie Turner, the station's chief, a woman whose eyes held a deep, weary kindness and who simply ensured a thermos of hot water and a stale roll appeared on his pallet each day. He knew she saw the ghost of the man he once was, and perhaps the shell of the man he was waiting to become nothing more than a memory. He often wondered why she tolerated his presence. This disgraced financial titan living amongst the city SC true heroes, but he never asked. Humiliation was his constant companion. Questions felt like asking for another beating. The rain started hammering against the corrugated metal roof, a sudden torrential downpour that turned the street outside into a churning river. The bay door shuddered open, and an exhausted EMT named Michael Brown pushed a small, dripping figure inside. Michael called out, pulling off his own soaked helmet, found her curled up under the awning of the old 7-Eleven, near hypothermia. Brandon slowly lifted his head. The girl couldn't have been more than 10. Her clothes were too thin for the November chill, pasted to her slight frame by the rain. Her hair, the color of wet cinder, stuck to a pale face dusted with freckles. But it was her eyes that seized Brandon large, a startlingly clear slate gray, and devoid of the easy innocence a child her age should possess. She clutched an object tightly to her chest, a beat ancient personal digital assistant, a relic of the late 90s, with a screen that was cracked and dark. Marie immediately sprang into action, directing Michael to wrap the girl in a warm blanket and bring her a mug of thick, sweet cocoa. No unaccompanied minors in the station, Micah. You know the policy. Marie sighed, her voice softening as she knelt before the girl. But good job. Bring her some dry clothes from the lost and found. The girl, silent, shivering, but fiercely determined, refused to relinquish the old PDA, holding it against the wool blanket as if it were a talisman of immense power. Her gaze slowly swept the bustling bay, bypassing the shiny red engines and the uniformed crew, before locking directly onto Brandon, still huddled in the shadows of his corner. A slow, unsettling moment of recognition stretched between them. The girl's eyes widened slightly, a tiny crack in her silent defense, and she began to move, pulling herself free from Marie's gentle hold. She walked across the oily concrete floor, each step a tiny deliberate act of will, until she stood a foot from Brandon's pallet. Her voice, when it came, was a raw, small scrape of sound, barely audible above the drumming rain on the roof. It wasn't a question of recognition from a news report. It was an accusation, flat and unwavering. Brandon felt a familiar nausea rise in his throat. Even here, in the cold anonymity of a city firehouse, the past was a predator with an impossibly long reach. "Go away, kid," he managed, his voice sounding rusty from disuse. "I have nothing for you." The girl shifted the PDA in her hand, adjusting her grip. "I don't want your money," she whispered, her eyes boring into his. "I want you to see this. The system was corrupted. It was..." Brandon recoiled as if slapped. The words framed and corrupted had been staples of his defense 4 years ago, before he had lost the will and the resources to fight. But to hear them from this child, a victim of the very disaster that had consumed his life, was a fresh wound. Framed. "Kid, the numbers destroyed my life. They killed my company, and they took my wife." He let out a harsh, dry laugh. It's not a toy, the girl insisted, her voice gaining a surprising tremor of intensity. She tapped the cracked screen of the PDA. It's the key. My mother, Ruth Jackson. She was an auditor. She tracked every single line of code, every transaction. She found the digital footprint that proved Paul Martin sabotaged the trading protocol. Brandon froze. Ruth Jackson. The name triggered a distant, sickening memory. At the time, Brandon had been too consumed by his own impending financial and personal doom to question the detail. The girl, let's call her Amy Young, he assumed was looking at him with a frightening mix of grief and resolution. Her small face held a determination that seemed to channel the unwavering spirit of her dead mother. They called it suicide because she lost everything in your fund, Amy continued, the tears finally welling up but never falling. But she was angry, Mr. Brooks. She was fighting, not giving up, a profound, sickening coldness, deeper than the damp air of the garage, washed over Brandon. His partner, his mentor, Paul Martin, a man he had idolized since business school. The man who had stood beside him throughout the entire federal inquiry. Had Paul truly orchestrated the entire collapse? Had he stolen over $250 million? And had he murdered this child's mother to cover his tracks? The cold dread of realization was suddenly overtaken by a white-hot righteous rage. This girl, shivering and alone, was clinging to a digital ghost that might be the only proof of his innocence and the ultimate key to justice for Ruth Jackson and all the other victims. The guilt that had crippled him was replaced in a blinding flash by purpose. Brandon asked, his voice now low, gravelly, and entirely present. Amy, she replied, Amy Young. And I need you, Mr. Brooks. Brandon looked at the small, soaked figure, at the PDA clutched like a weapon, and at the steely resolve in her gray eyes. He stood up, slowly, his joints protesting with a stiffness that was more spiritual than physical. The movement felt seismic. Maria was watching them from the counter, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. Brandon turns his spine straight for the first time in years. His eyes, once glazed with defeat, now burned with a predatory clarity. Marie, he said, his voice ringing with an authority he thought he had buried forever. We need dry clothes, a hot meal, and a very secure place to access a terminal. He looked back at Amy, extending a hand that, though trembling, was firm. They may have stolen my life, Amy, but they won't steal your truth. Amy's hand slipped into his. It was small, cold, and surprisingly strong. The path back from the abyss, Brandon realized, was not through solitary penance, but through shared resolve. The downpour outside seemed to intensify, washing the city clean. But inside the firehouse, the true storm was only just beginning to gather force. Brandon and Amy found temporary sanctuary in the substation's basement. Marie, utilizing her considerable authority and compassion, had cleared out an old storage area, a dusty room formerly used for storing obsolete fire-resistant equipment. It was far from luxurious, containing only a cot and a battered metal desk, but it was dry, warm, and, crucially, secure. It felt less like a prison and more like a forward operating base. The silence of the basement, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the building's ventilation system, was conducive to the focused intensity they needed. Amy, wrapped in a fleece blanket and clutching a mug of cocoa, had finally yielded the battered PDA. It was a relic, an old Palm Pilot equivalent, but its exterior had been modified, its original casing replaced with a hardshell polymer, and a small, almost invisible biometric scanner embedded near the power button. My mom made it tamper-proof, Amy explained, her voice gaining confidence now that she was warm and the focus was on the evidence, not her personal trauma. She always said, the older the tech, the less likely they are to look at it for the new exploits. Brandon was mesmerized. He had designed trading algorithms that controlled billions, but this small, broken device represented a level of defensive integrity he had foolishly neglected in his own system. It was a painful, immediate lesson in humility. He finally managed to persuade Amy to attempt the login after several hours of painstaking discussion about her mother's habits. On the 7th try, using a complex sequence of phrases, Ruth Jackson had written on the back of an old grocery receipt, a final ironic testament to her low-key life, the PDA word to life, bathing the darkroom in the green glow of a legacy interface. Engi, Amy, sitting beside Brandon, began to explain the mathematics. Her mother hadn't taught her standard algebra. She had taught her binary logic, digital footprints, and audit trails. 5% dollar, Amy said, pointing to a line of code. It was supposed to be instantaneous, but randomized between $35 and $130 milliseconds to prevent detection. Her tiny finger traced a sequence of functions. Brandon stared, his mind reeling as the puzzle pieces slammed into place. The $67 second delay. That window, just over a minute, was long enough for Paul Martin's insider trading network to capitalize on the public knowledge of the inevitable crash before Apollo could execute the failsafe sell order. It was a digital chokehold, perfectly timed to ensure maximum loss for Nexus Global while the conspirators reaped massive profits on the short side. The short positions, they would have multiplied their exposure 70 times over in that window, Brandon murmured. The rage returned, colder and sharper. Paul Martin had not only destroyed Brandon's life and stolen his firm, he had turned Brandon into the public face of his own crime. Amy, sensing his internal turmoil, placed a small, reassuring hand on his arm. My mom also found the ledger, she said softly. The one that shows where the money went. It's encrypted within the log file. Brandon knew exactly who they needed. Nicholas Young, Amy's uncle, Ruth's younger brother. Nicholas, a notoriously cynical and brilliant systems administrator for a city utility, had testified briefly at the SEC inquiry, dismissed by the commission as a disgruntled relative. Brandon reached out using Marie's old, untraceable name. Nicholas, initially hostile and still consumed by grief and resentment towards Brandon, reluctantly agreed to meet, only because Amy was involved. The meeting took place in the bleak pre-dawn cold of a municipal parking lot. Nicholas Matherdy's wiry and perpetually anxious, recognized his niece immediately and embraced her fiercely. His anger towards Brandon was palpable. You lost my sister's future, Brooks, Nicholas hissed. His eyes narrowed. Your sister found the truth. Nicholas, Brandon retorted, forcing the PDA into Nicholas's reluctant hands. She wasn't defeated. She was murdered because she uncovered a $350 million theft orchestrated by Paul Martin. This key proves it, but we need your help to unearth the deeper ledger. Nicholas worked on the device for an hour inside his car, the dashboard light illuminating his tense face. When he finally looked up, his expression was shattered. The $67 second lag. That's genius and sickening. Ruth, she built a complete mirror of the pre-crash logs on this. And the deeper encryption, it's a ledger. Paul created dozens of shell companies. He moved $350 million in 3 distinct transfers to 3 different offshore accounts. The proof is all here, but Nicholas Cachon looking from Amy to Brandon, I had to bypass an FBI seal to get this deep. The next piece of the puzzle had to come from within. Brandon's mind raced, searching for the one person at Nexus who was both ethical and vulnerable enough to flip. Janae Phillips, the firm's head of compliance, a single mother, mid-40s, known for her meticulous, almost obsessive commitment to regulatory detail, and who Paul Martin had fired days after the collapse. Janet, Brandon declared. She was the moral compass. Paul must have leveraged her son's rare neurological condition, the need for constant, expensive, specialized medical care. The confrontation with Janet was tense. Brandon tracked her to a modest office in Queens, where she now worked as a compliance officer for a local credit union. She recoiled upon seeing him, her face immediately draining of color. Don't, Brandon, she pleaded, holding up a hand. You'll ruin me again. Paul is going down. Janet, Brandon stated, his voice devoid of accusation, filled only with grim certainty. And when he realizes his defense is failing, he will expose you for the fabricated testimony he forced you to give. You testified I was negligent. You testified you saw no irregularities. Janet's resolve crumbled. Tears streamed silently down her face. He said if I didn't comply, the firm's insurance would suddenly discover a pre-existing condition clause, and my son's care would be terminated. You do now, he countered. Presenting Nicholas's analysis of the PDA, we have the technical proof of his theft and sabotage. What we need from you is the paper trail of the internal memos, the emails where you flagged his questionable transactions, the minutes from the meetings where he silenced you. Give us the clean documentation, and we'll secure immunity for you before we file the charges. Janet looked at the PDA analysis, at the figures that proved Brandon was telling the truth, and a weary determination set in. I have everything, she whispered. I copied everything, not for revenge, but for survival. I hid a thumb drive in a safety deposit box. The pieces were assembling with terrifying speed, propelled by the relentless current of injustice. Brandon felt a strange sense of elation mixed with profound fear. They were no longer just seeking redemption. They were building an iron cage for one of Wall Street's most ruthless men. And at the heart of this volatile mission was Amy, no longer the shivering girl in the garage, but a beacon of fearless truth, his guide and his reason for fighting. As they prepared for the final ascent, the emotional bond between the disgraced CEO and the victim's daughter solidified, found family unit forged in the fire of shared loss and a common, consuming quest for justice. The fight was about to leave the shadows of the firehouse basement and enter the public light. The final pieces of the evidence, the highly volatile and irrefutable core of the case, rested on a tiny, unremarkable thumb drive provided by Janet Phillips. Inside the drive were 4 years of detailed compliance logs, flagged transactions, and a chilling chain of emails proving Paul Martin had systematically overridden every regulatory safeguard Brandon had put in place. Armed with this, Brandon, Amy, and Nicholas met with Deborah Harris, a renowned prosecutor specializing in corporate fraud who had earned her reputation fighting the very firms Brandon used to run. Deborah, initially skeptical, spent an afternoon reviewing the evidence, the $67 second lag analysis from the Janet's compliance documents, and the detailed ledger of the $350 million stolen funds. She looked up, her expression grim but resolute. "This is not just enough to exonerate you, Mr. Brooks," she said, tapping the thumb drive. They were prepared to file criminal charges immediately, but Paul was one step ahead. Paul knew the paranoia that Brandon had fought to repress for 4 years burst into reality. He knew he was the target, but Paul was using Amy as the anchor to drag him down. Brandon immediately moved Amy. He convinced Marie to let him store the most precious thing in his life in the Station S reinforced temperature-controlled filing cabinet room, a massive bolted vault used for storing sensitive personnel records. It was uncomfortable, but it was the only place he felt she was truly safe from Paul's reach. The next morning, they discovered Paul had fled, taking a private jet to the Turks and Caicos, a known non-extradition sanctuary. "He's run," Nicholas stated, slamming his fist onto the metal desk. 6 months is 6 months too long," Amy interjected, stepping out from the filing room. She was calm, her gray eyes reflecting the fierce resolve she had inherited from her mother. "He ran because he values his status more than his freedom. He's a brand. He has to come back and fight the accusation, or he loses his name, his clients, everything he stole." Amy's logic was ruthless and brilliant. Brandon and Deborah immediately organized a press conference at the City Hall Plaza. The event was a media frenzy. Deborah presented the digital evidence, the compliance logs, and Janet Phillips, who stood stoically behind the podium, delivering her testimony with a quiet, devastating certainty. Then Brandon spoke. He didn't speak of his own losses. He spoke of the 45 victims who had committed suicide or suffered devastating financial ruin, of Ruth Jackson, the brilliant auditor who was killed for discovering the truth, and finally, he pointed to Amy. "This little girl," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction, "is holding the key to a truth that a man thought he could bury with a $350 million theft and a cover-up. Paul Martin, you can run, but you cannot hide from the digital footprint you created. You lost in a sprawling beachfront mansion in the Caribbean." Paul Martin watched the live stream. The sight of Brandon Brooks, his former protege and now his fiercest opponent, standing next to the victim's daughter, detonated his fragile composure. The phone calls, the panicked emails, the immediate freezing of assets. It was a coordinated, catastrophic failure of his entire empire. His ego could not withstand the accusation of cowardice. He booked the next available flight back to New York. The trap had been set, and Paul, predictable in his vanity, had walked right into it. Paul Martin's arrest at JFK Airport was a media spectacle. The ensuing trial, which lasted 20 months, was a battle of attrition. Paul's hyper-defense team attacked every shred of evidence, painting Brandon as a desperate mastermind and Janet as a disgruntled employee. But the momentum shifted the day Amy Young, now Onzi, took the stand. Small behind the enormous microphone, she spoke not as a child, but as an expert. She explained the 67-second lag protocol with a clarity and precision that was "The numbers don't lie," she told the hushed jury, her gaze steady. "They showed the moment the system changed. They showed the moment my mother was betrayed, when the defense attorney tried to discredit her. Suggesting Brandon had coached her, Amy looked directly at the jury. Mr. Brooks didn't teach me what to say. He taught me that when you have the facts, you must speak them. The jury was out for 4 days. The tension was unbearable, but on the morning of the 5th day, the verdict was delivered. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Brandon felt the tension of 4 long years finally leave his body, and he reached for Amy, pulling her into a tight, life-affirming embrace. Paul Martin received a sentence of 40 years in federal prison. His assets were seized and earmarked for victim restitution. Brandon Brooks was formally and publicly exonerated, but the old life was gone, replaced by a new, more meaningful reality. Brandon established the Ruth Jackson Digital Integrity Fellowship, dedicated to helping low-income families fight corporate fraud. He worked with regulators, using his vast knowledge for good, not gain. Most significantly, he formally adopted Amy Young. 7 years later, Brandon Brooks, 49, stood on the commencement stage of his alma mater, giving the keynote address. His hair was streaked with gray, his suit simple, but his eyes were clear, reflecting a peace he thought he'd never possess. He spoke of his downfall, his despair. In the morning, a small, determined girl stood before him in a firehouse garage. He pointed to Amy, now Dezoito graduating at the top of her class, holding the antique PDA key which she still cherished. Redemption is not about getting back what you lost, Brandon concluded, his voice resonant with hard-won wisdom. It's about finding the courage to protect what you find. Amy and her mother's truth gave me back my purpose. As the ovation thundered, Amy ran up, her arms wrapping around him. The word dad still filled Brandon with profound gratitude. He looked toward the bright future they had built together, a future not defined by billions, but by integrity and a fierce, unconventional love. Thank you for watching this story of courage, digital justice, and finding family where you least expect it. If you believe in the power of second chances and the light that a single brave soul can bring to the world, please join our community. Hitting that subscribe button helps us share more stories that inspire and remind us of the better angels of our nature. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us what city you are watching our stories from and what major life lesson you took away from Brandon and Amy's journey. Did you like the video? And what did you learn from it?